you are representing a group that basically is funding you to go statewide and present this film, 9500 Liberty. And I think that there's a confluence of missions which is basically trying to foster a productive conversation about this issue. And it would seem to me that there's a lot of work left to be done in that regard.
Yes, but I'm very confident that it's going to get better. In the story that we went through, which is very much linked to your story, because what you referred to as outsiders who wrote our law in Prince William County also wrote your law. This is an anti-immigration lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., who have sort of a menu of boilerplate pieces of legislation that they suggest to local advocates against illegal immigration and politicians.
Well, in fact, then, to what extent are these smaller legislations really modeled after federal legislation, as is claimed?
Oh, that's not accurate. That is a claim that is made in order to counter the supremacy argument, which is actually the foundation of the the Justice Department's case against SB 1070. They're not actually talking about racial profiling in that case. What they're saying is that because we all agreed to be one nation in 1787, we ratified the Constitution. Actually, it was 1788. What we agreed to do is not have separate policies for each state with regard to foreign relations or trade or immigration. And to have one state decide to make their own immigration policy is in violation of our Constitution, the supremacy clause of our Constitution.
Well, then the people of Arizona then have been lied to by its governor and other people who contend that SB 1070 is a mirror image of federal legislation, and so therefore what could be wrong with it?
Well, I wouldn't say lie, but I think that who knows to what degree the governor really understands what's in the Constitution. I think that people use it to further their agenda in the present tense. If we all agree to be one nation, then we should have one policy with regard to things like foreign policy, immigration, and trade.
And I understand that, and I don't want to over-belabor this, but it really sticks out in my mind. And once again, I told you before we started this interview, I do understand both sides of this issue, and I truly do. And I don't really get awfully worked up about one side or the other. I think there's problems on both sides. But it seems to me like it was made very clear by this governor and others that this is a mirror image of federal laws, legislation, and reflected absolutely the Constitution. And I don't know, if you don't call that a lie, what do you call it? I mean, I don't think you can really blame it on ignorance.
I think it's spin, but let me give you an example of why. If we agree to stay one nation, if we agree that unity as a people is important, that we should allow the federal government to have the jurisdiction that the Constitution outlines. Let's say that we had an embargo against North Korea because of our fear that they're going to develop nuclear weapons. And so no trade between the United States and North Korea. And then let's just say the state of North Dakota decides that, we're going to mirror federal policy. And we are going to have a policy that requires anyone who we have reasonable suspicion might be Korean. We need to check and make sure they're not doing any trade with their relatives in North Korea. Annabelle, by the way, has relatives in North Korea and South Korea.
I see.
My partner.
That's tough.
That would be unfair. Oh, yeah, it's a terrible tragedy for her family, what happened in that war. And it's part of the reason why Annabelle and I are very much pacifists when it comes to people who try to divide our country in America. But in any case, if the state of North Dakota decided they were going to help federal policy by having their own embargo against North Korea, you could make the argument, yes, it mirrors the federal policy. But let's just say that our State Department wanted to relax that embargo in order to give the North Koreans an incentive to allow inspectors. Well, if North Dakota is doing its own embargo, that will impede the federal government's ability to do its foreign policy. So I think there's a good reason why our forefathers declared that if we are to become one nation, that the separate individual states cannot be making their own policies.
Right. Or we cease to be a nation.
Right. And unfortunately, the argument that we shouldn't necessarily have a strong federal government, that's part of our it's part of the fabric of our society as well. The anti-federalists opposed the ratification of the Constitution, and many Virginians opposed the ratification of the Constitution, including Patrick Henry. But there are other Virginians, such as James Madison and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who supported being one nation. The anti-federalists eventually grew into the Confederates and really used Patrick Henry's argument against the Constitution to justify the secession of the southern states after the election of Abraham Lincoln. And today I would say that the inheritors of the anti-federalist argument or the Confederate argument are those who oppose the civil rights legislation. Or, in Virginia in 1967, the federal government struck down a law that banned interracial marriage in Virginia. 1967, the year my parents were married, in fact, was the year that we were allowed to marry people of different races in Virginia. So I think that there is a long tradition of people who oppose the federal government making laws that apply to people in the different states. But in my opinion, when we ratified the Constitution, and if not then, when we had our Civil War, we decided that a house divided cannot stand, and that we must be one country.
And let me ask you, you're a person in your 30s?
Yes.
And where do you get your education? You seem to be fairly well educated in these things.
I went to college. I actually majored in film, but I'm concerned that there are people who are trying to appropriate the Constitution for their political agenda in the way that sometimes holy texts are appropriated, such as the Quran or the Bible. And often when people do that, if they succeed, they are able to further very, very radical agendas. And I see that there are elements in our society that are trying to do that with the Constitution, so I've taken it upon myself to learn as much as I can about our Constitution and about the writing of the Constitution. And in fact, another of my projects, the Coffee Party, we have our first national convention on September 24th through September 26th. That's the weekend, the last weekend of September in Louisville, Kentucky. And one of the things we're going to be doing, actually, is having a long, intensive mock constitutional convention where we look at the Constitution as it exists now and consider some changes that may be necessary. And it's led by Mark McKinnon, who is John McCain's former campaign strategist, also for George W. Bush, and Lawrence Lessig, who is a law professor from Harvard.